Alrighty, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and good day. Welcome to the CES Letters. I'm joined here with my good friend, Steve Harper. Steve, how are you?
I'm great, Easton. How are you today?
I'm just wonderful.
Good.
Guys, Steve is one of the smartest guys I think I know, pretty darn close.
You got to expand your circle of
get a bigger group of people.
Yeah.
Steve is the author of many books, and today we're going to be talking about The First Vision, and he has authored two books about The First Vision. How many books have you authored?
I lost track.
Multiple.
Yeah.
Many. And many academic articles that are just incredible. My favorite book that he has written about The First Vision is Memory and Mormon Origins. Is that the title?
Yes.
Excellent book that looks into what memory is and why there might be multiple accounts to The First Vision. It's very, very good, very interesting. In addition to that, Steve worked on the Joseph Smith Papers Project. He was the managing historian of the First Saints book.
Yep.
He is editor-in-chief of BYU Studies. He works on Wilford Woodruff papers. Any other important biography things we need?
Oh, yeah.
Your grandpa?
No, yeah.
Husband?
Those are the things I do for work.
Cool. I guess you're a religion professor at BYU
That's right
now. That's
right.
a big important thing too.
Yep.
So without further ado, I present to you First Vision with our good friend, Stephen C. Harper. Steve, as we get started, I think it's important that we point out that you are one of the foremost experts of the First Vision right now. You've studied it more than most people. You've read more of the primary sources than most people. So my first question, just kind of as an icebreaker, why did you decide to go into the First Vision? What was it about the First Vision that drew you to
When
it?
I was an undergraduate student at BYU, I had got very intensely interested in church history from my class, Joseph Smith and the Restoration. And so my wife agreed to go with me on a travel study semester to Nauvoo, Illinois. And our professor there was Milton Bachman. He literally wrote the book on the First Vision accounts. So I spent a semester with him, like more than you would normally with a professor. We lived in the same area, the same neighborhood, and all we really had to do was study church history in Nauvoo. So I read his book. He taught me all about the multiple accounts of the First Vision. So my awareness and exposure to them came from a different philosophical approach than the way the CES letter or other skeptical approaches take, right? They say, well, did you know there are 4 accounts? And there's something sinister in that. And it's supposed to be disconcerting. If you study with Milton Bachman, so he's an Ivy League PhD, University of Pennsylvania PhD. He's a fantastic historian, great at the historical method. And he doesn't teach me that way. He says, my goodness, did you know there's these multiple accounts of vision? We get to study them this semester.
Right.
Can you imagine a greater thing to do? So my whole orientation is different. And that's why I felt this longing over time that I wish I could help people have that experience that I had. And then another major catalyst is the 2008 summer seminar that Richard Bushman led at BYU. For years and years, he would gather students, scholars together in the summer, and they'd tackle some problem or other. And the opportunity I had to attend was in 2008, and the topic was Joseph Smith and his critics. And Professor Bushman did what Professor Bushman does, which was take a charitable approach, both to historical figures, right, and to the critics, and to their victims, to those who are impacted by their attacks on the restored gospel. He said, let's stop, fighting with the critics. Let's turn our attention to those who are hurt by them, whose faith is diminished or undermined. What could we do for them? Today we would use the term minister. What should be our ministry to them? And so with that way of thinking in mind, we sort of chose topics to write about. And I picked the First Vision. And it was a turning point for me because I already knew the evidence, the historical record. I knew it pretty well by then. But what I had not done is thought about how would I respond to the critics of the first vision, Fawn Brodie or Reverend Wesley Walters, the Methodist minister even, who rejected it right out of hand? How would I respond to them like Professor Bushman does, with faith and hope and with charity? Intense, well-informed by the historical method, not a sort of lackadaisical or nonchalant or mediocre approach in terms of history, writing, and thinking, but also not being a jerk, right? Not making the problem worse by, responding without those, Professor Bushman calls it the hermeneutic of trust. Let's take a trusting approach to Joseph Smith. That doesn't mean a non-critical approach, a non-analytical approach, but it means let's not start with the prejudice that he is a lying con man from the beginning. Let's see what the historical record offers us. And at the same time, let's not go in there with guns blazing toward people who don't believe him or haven't accepted his witness. Maybe we could imagine why there are sound or valid reasons for their choices too, right? We could approach them with the kind of respect that human beings deserve. So that way of thinking and being more Christ-like, at the same time, more analytically minded and more Christ-like, is a major blessing to me. I don't think we'd be doing CES Letters the way we're doing it if I hadn't had that experience quite a long time ago. And I don't mean to suggest that I've mastered it the way Professor Bushman has, in my judgment, but I'm really grateful for that mentoring. And that's why from then on, I wrote a seminar paper, but I started researching the first vision. And as you said, a series of books and articles come out of that, including the one you mentioned was published by Oxford University Press. And I say that because it's a big deal. Yeah.
Big deal.
Oxford University Press doesn't publish books that they think are hack or not passing muster, academically speaking. To reach that threshold shows that they think it reaches the highest standard of academic integrity and historical method, that its claims are defensible, and that it advances knowledge in a useful way. So to me, that was a really big deal. I wanted to accomplish that in my career.
Was it the book that took the most effort, would you say?
Yeah, in some ways it is, right? It takes a decade to write a book like that.
Right.
And I don't know if it took, the most raw hours, but definitely you got to read widely, right? I realized along the way that the insight I could offer, the new dimension I could explore, is what would happen if you married, the historical method, reading the historical documents carefully and thoroughly and in light of their context. What would happen if you married that with the science of memory studies, with this, what psychologists and memory scholars have discovered about the nature of memory? And that's what the book is. It's the marriage of those two things, those two disciplines. So I could do the historical part myself, and then I had to consult the world's experts on memory formation and reformation, or consolidation. And that was a lot of fun. It's a really stretching,
I'm sure,
exercise, and I still feel proud about it. I'm really grateful for that book. Among other things, it makes it hard to say, well, Steve Harper doesn't know what he's talking about.
Right.
You can say a lot of other things, right? Granted, I'm not Richard Bushman, that's for sure, but I know what I'm talking about.
You're also half his age, so.
Yeah. I know what I'm talking about when it comes to the first vision of Joseph Smith.
Right. It's really impressive. And I think that gives kind of a good preface to what we're going to be discussing today. And so just to kind of give a layout, and this is going to be a quick one. We already have 2 other episodes. This one, we're just going to do a higher quality. So we're just going to spend a couple minutes on each of these. Mm-hmm. And that is 4 different accounts to the first vision, 4 different primary accounts of the first vision, contradictions, late appearances of the first vision, and we'll look at the time and see where we go from there. The first thing, though, that I'd like to talk about is President Gordon B. Hinckley said, and this is at the beginning of this section of the CES letter, he said, quote, "Our whole strength rests on the validity of that first vision. Mm-hmm. It either occurred or it did not occur. If it did not, then this work is a fraud. If it did, then it is the most important and wonderful work under the heavens." Now, Steve, the first vision has not always been the most important part of our church. Yeah. But I feel like it's been stressed, especially the last couple decades. How has that happened? Why is it all or nothing for the first vision?
I wrote an article, as you may well know, about that, right? How the first vision became all or nothing,
right?
Raising the stakes. It's available free online at BYU Studies, and it's a fascinating history, right? It is. As you say, and as James Allen, another founding father of scholarly first vision studies, who recently passed away, a hero to me, a mentor to me, like Professor Bachman and Professor Bushman. As he showed in his research on the first vision, the earliest Latter-day Saints don't seem to be aware of the first vision. And to the degree that they may be, they don't talk about it as a catalyst in their belief. They don't cite it when they're saying, that's why I believe. So they cite the new covenant being restored, and the evidence of that being the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. That's how the missionaries approach them. So it'll be 1840, 42 before we start seeing published accounts of the first vision. And it'll be 40 years after that before it's canonized. Mm-hmm. And really, honestly, before the prophets are even talking about it in the way that we talk about it in the church today. Right. Well,
it's the first lesson for missionaries today.
Yeah, right. That's what a historian expects, is this kind of change over time. Now, if we're not a historian, or if we're not careful in our thinking, we bring assumptions to the table. We think, well, if there was a first vision, then Joseph Smith would have talked about it right then that day. It would have been in front page headlines in every newspaper in the land, and there would be records of it right then and there, and it would have been the basis of the church from day one. Well, none of those things is proved. They're just assumed. And there are plenty of good reasons to ask why. Why would we assume that? Why would we necessarily think that? Well, we would if we wanted to impeach Joseph Smith, right? If our goal was not to understand him and assess whether he had a vision or not, right? Sincerely seeking to know the answer to that question. If that's our starting point, we're going to listen to what he has to say. This is what Richard Bushman does. He listens really, really well to everybody from the past that he's trying to study, whether that's Muhammad or Jonathan Edwards or whoever, Joseph Smith. He treats them all with this kind of respect. Others, Dan Bogle or others, start from a different beginning point, and that is, I don't trust you at all. Mm-hmm. I know you're lying to me.
And I'm going to prove it.
I'm going to prove it. Yeah. So depending on what you choose, what Professor Bushman calls the hermeneutic of trust or the hermeneutic of suspicion, you arrive at a different place. Now, the important thing to notice is they both use the same body of facts. They both have access to the same historical record. The documents are the same. One of them doesn't have a pile of evidence that the other one doesn't know about. And so the determinant here is what you're going to decide the facts mean. It's really like the glass half full or half empty example, right? You can see the exact same facts. There are 4 accounts, primary accounts of the first vision. They give versions of the story that are not precisely the same over time. They change over time. And you could decide to interpret that in a variety of ways, believing ways and unbelieving ways.
Right.
And it's not satisfactory to simply say, well, you're dumb if you treat it believing or unbelieving, right? The people who are not believing are not dumb. They're well informed, right? I share a completely different reading of the accounts than Professor Ann Taves does, but she is a phenomenally brilliant scholar who knows all the same evidence I do. That is to say, really well-informed people can come to different conclusions about this evidence. It's not the evidence itself that is the determinant of belief or not.
Right.
You have to decide whether you're going to approach these things with faith in God and Christ, and that they picked Joseph Smith or not.
Right.
I really want people to understand that. There's a thought out there that if you just knew the evidence, you wouldn't believe. And alternatively, if you just knew the evidence, you'd be forced to the conclusion of belief.
Right.
Neither one of those is true. Yeah.
Right. I think it's important, we talk about this often, is triangulating the evidence.
Right.
And in my opinion, when we're talking about religious, spiritual things, one of those things that we should triangulate the evidence with is the Spirit.
It has to be that way.
Mm-hmm.
How can you know whether Joseph Smith is telling the truth about seeing the Father and the Son in the woods of Western New York unless the Father or the Son reveals that to you? You cannot know it.
Right.
You can know what he says about it. You can believe that you've disproved it because you've amassed these facts. That's not the same as knowing one way or the other.
Right.
You can bring the historical method to bear. Reverend Wesley Walters did this in the 1960s. Right? He's a Presbyterian minister. And for him, there's an immense amount at stake. As you know, the manuscript history account of Joseph's vision says, "Mom, I learned for myself Presbyterianism isn't true." Well, Presbyterianism means the world to Wesley Walters, right? He's a young man who feels like he is going to hell forever. He grows up in a Baptist context, and he hasn't had the experience of being born again in Christ. And then he goes to a revival, and the Reverend Donald Barnhouse speaks and gives this wonderful analogy about how Christ's saving work occurs in our lives. And Reverend Walters, then a young man, teenage Wesley Walters, is filled with the spirit of it. He gets the experience he had longed for. Well, for the rest of his life, he's going to defend that, right? And I don't doubt any of that. I think that's the greatest thing, except that there's another step beyond that. I think the restoration adds to that. And so I feel similar with Joseph Smith, right? This is the version of the gospel, the restored version, is the one that does the work in my life that the Reverend Donald Barnhouse's version of the gospel did for Wesley Walters. All this means that I can sympathize very much with Wesley Walters when he says, I am going to dig through every archive, every Methodist newspaper, every report of any kind of camp meeting I can to show that there was no unusual religious excitement on the subject of religion in Joseph's region when he said there was. And if that didn't happen, then the vision didn't happen.
Right.
So that was his case. He thought it was proved. In some ways, it seems proved, but not if you keep digging.
Right.
Which Professor Bachman did.
Mm-hmm.
And Professor Allen and Richard Anderson and Richard Bushman. So Truman Madsen, philosophy professor at BYU, was sort of heading up a special issue of BYU Studies and other efforts to respond to Wesley Walters. They actually had a pretty fun exchange at Southern Illinois University. They were both attending an event there, and Professor Madsen sees Wesley Walters' name tag, and he said, "Wesley Walters, you're the one who dropped the bomb on BYU. They're giving us all the money we need to respond to you," right?
That's awesome.
They have this pleasant exchange. And so Professor Bushman, right off winning the Bancroft Prize, the ultra prestigious prize for an American historian, is invited to respond to Wesley Walters, which he does in his characteristic style, with charity, with a thoroughly informed response, and with critical analysis that's really hard to impeach. And so that's the way this conversation has been going for well over 50 years now. And people who know the exact same evidence thoroughly come down on different sides. They interpret the evidence to mean different things. And I interpret it to mean that Joseph Smith was picked by Jesus Christ to be his servant. But before that, he was told, Joseph, my son, your sins are forgiven. He was an angsty teenager thinking that Presbyterianism was probably right, which meant that he felt a lot like Wesley Walters did as a teenager, like that salvation boat had passed him right by.
Right.
And Joseph longed for Methodism to be right because that would mean he had a chance. He could affect salvation in Christ by sort of willing himself to receive God's grace. Whereas at the time, the Presbyterian version was God has already decided that, and there's nothing, it's his inscrutable sovereign will, and there's not a thing you can do about it. So Joseph hoped Methodism was right, but he thought that probably Presbyterianism better fit his lived experience. And he had to know. He had to know. And that's why he went to the woods. And the vision taught him that neither one of these versions has it exactly right, but you are forgiven of your sins. And I'll make the fullness of the gospel known to you at some future point. I believe that. I believe Joseph tells me the truth. Now, a person would say, and I would say, why? Why do you believe that? What's at stake here? What are your motives, right? Are there prejudices you're trying to deal with here? Are there things what's the psychological component of this? And I think everybody ought to ask themselves those questions. Everybody ought to think critically and carefully, but thinking critically and carefully does not mean coming to the conclusion that it didn't happen. That often is a result of not thinking terribly critically or very carefully about it, and maybe not examining your own motives and intentions.
Right. Think slow.
Think slow so you know how you know what you know.
Right. So, Steve, how many accounts of the first vision were there?
What we know of is 4 that came to us from Joseph Smith or someone he was working closely with. So he worked very closely with Frederick Williams in the late summer or fall of 1832 to give us this 6-page autobiography, a history of the life of Joseph Smith and the marvelous things that Jesus does through him. It's an awesome little record, raw and rough from Joseph's perspective and a modern reader's, but also beautiful and profound. And it's our earliest one that we have, mostly written in his own hand. 3 years later, he's giving a spontaneous account of the vision to a visitor from New York, and his scribe captures a version of it in Joseph's journal. So November 9th, 1835 journal entry gives us an account of the vision. The next one is going to start in 1838 before the saints are exterminated from Missouri, but then he's going to go through that Liberty Jail experience before he sits down again and revises and captures it in the version we have today, which is in his manuscript history book A1, and it's excerpted for us in the Pearl of Great Price. That's the one that's most commonly known. And then the 4th of the 4 that we get from him during his lifetime is a letter to John Wentworth, a newspaper editor in Chicago, where Joseph responds to his invitation to furnish primary evidence that Wentworth's friend could use to write a history of New Hampshire. We don't have the letter Joseph sent to Wentworth, but they published it. The Saints published it in their own newspaper in the Times and Seasons. So we have that version of it. It's short. It's designed for a kind of a public consumption for an audience. It's designed to do PR work. The manuscript history one is very much characterized by the violent persecution that the saints are suffering. It's as if Joseph is saying, where did this persecution start? Oh, yeah, it started when I was an infant almost. It started the minute that I told the minister about my vision, and he slammed me. So he's looking back on his life in this particularly combative present, and he finds this moment of bitter persecution. So that one is understandably and very interestingly the most intense and most shaped by the persecution the saints suffer in Ohio and especially in Missouri. A few years later, when things are at a comparative lull, the Nauvoo Charter is making things safe. Joseph revises that account, interestingly, and he cuts out a lot of that intense persecution part, right? The whole beginning, owing to the many reports put in circulation by evil disposed and designing people, he just cuts that off and says, I was born in Sharon, Vermont.
Right. Let's make it a little bit more peacemaker.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we all remember our past in the present. That people might say, duh. Well, thank you, Professor Harper. What a Captain Obvious.
Right.
But there's a lot of implication to that. We don't store memories intact, autobiographical memories. We make them up right here, right now. We make them out of what Harvard psychology professor Daniel Schachter calls traces. Nobody knows quite what to call this stuff or how to describe it or even where it is. But we have these pieces at our disposal. And when we need to make a memory, we take those things that we've stored from past experience and we mix them with our present situation and context, our present purposes and prejudices and so forth. And we create the memory right there in real time. That's why it's fascinating to study these memories from 1832, 35, 38, 39, 1842. They are combinations of what Joseph experienced in the grove and what he was experiencing at the time he did the remembering. And that's the best way to look at them and to learn why they say what they say and how they work the way they work and what they're doing, what they're for. So
right. And as a matter of fact, if he said it word for word the exact same every time, it would seem as if it was more of a fictional story, one that he's created, and I need to remember point A and point B and point C, and this is my point, and blah, 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 whatever. And it's different every time. Tell us why that's okay. Why is it not a bad thing that it's different every time?
Well, you're on to a great question here. Why would I assume that it is bad, that it's different every time, right? You're noticing that people who make that claim are asserting a premise that is far from proved. What if we did that with the resurrection accounts of Jesus? Well, we'd have to reject it.
Right.
What if we did it with the accounts of Saul converting? We'd have to reject that ever happened. What if we did it with Alma the Younger? And what if we did it with our own lives, right? You could take anybody out there who was willing and honest and open, and you could survey them about the most important past experience of their life. And you could ask them, you could interview them over time, or you could have them sort of tell it in various spots and different ways over the course of a year. And you would get something very similar to the first vision accounts of Joseph Smith. This is the way people remember. His accounts are not anomalous. They're characteristic. They're typical of the ways people remember. Stephen Prothero, very highly regarded religion scholar at Boston, this is what he said. This is what he concluded in his book about American Jesus is your very point there, right? People are hypercritical of these accounts of Joseph, but those people are not typically historians or lawyers who are used to working with various accounts from people of the same experience and realize you can expect variation. You can expect difference. And it does not necessarily follow they lied to me flat out. There may be things they got wrong. There may be distortions. It would be shocking if there are not memory distortions. That's not the same as lying or getting it wrong. Me
and my friends were playing a game last week, and part of the game was you had to tell an embarrassing story from the past. And this girl started telling her story, and she finished. She goes, I forgot to say the embarrassing part. She had said the whole story, but forgot the one most important part. Yeah. So then she went back and retold the story. And even though it was the same story, 2 minutes apart from each other, there were more details the second time. There was a different perspective on the second time. And then she got to that important part. Yeah. Likewise, Joseph Smith, some of these accounts, it's on the fly. I'm going to share this experience, and it was an incredible experience. Other times it is planned, thought out. He's thinking about the sentences he should say. He's thinking, like you said, he took out part of it when he went back the second time. And so some are planned where he's going to be able to think it through a little bit more. Some are just him talking to his friends.
Professor Schachter calls the difference that you're noticing spontaneous memory. That's what Joseph does in 1835. And when Joseph does that, it moves faster and it's less freighted down by his concern about his limitations in writing. When he does what Professor Schachter calls strategic memory, that is, today I'm going to write my past. He feels burdened by that. It's hard for him to do. He starts with a disclaimer, both in the 1832 autobiography and the 1838-39 manuscript history. And so you're exactly right. This is human remembering. And it can be frustrating. People want to say, well, just tell me what happened. Just do the past. And when I started out in history, I thought that I could do that. I thought I can recover a perfect past. You just show me the primary sources and I'll show you exactly what happened. And along the way, wise people like Professor Bushman and others said, son, you cannot do that. And thinking you can do that is a cognitive distortion in itself. It's not a very well considered view. And this is how Dan Vogle's biography of Joseph Smith starts out. He says, since there are these multiple records over time, how certain can we be that Joseph remembered the vision that it actually happened at the time? And his point there is clearly he can't. He didn't remember it as it happened. He made it up or he misremembered. And then the next thing Vogel says is, so I'm going to tell you what actually happened. I call that subjectivity squared, right? If you think I can take Joseph's subjective accounts and turn them into an objective account, how? By what magic or miracle? You can't, Professor Bushman teaches us. You can only take Joseph's subjective accounts and you can study them super carefully and well, and you can add your own subjectivity to it. You've just multiplied subjectivities. You haven't arrived at some perfect, pristine version. We can only approximate the past with the historical method. And then we have to decide, well, am I going to believe? Am I going to believe the gist of the idea that God called Joseph Smith? He visited him and forgave his sins and so forth. That's a matter not of historical proving or not proving. A historian lacks the tools to prove any of that beyond any kind of doubt. There will always be doubt.
Unless they have a time machine.
Yeah, that'd be cool, wouldn't it?
Wouldn't it?
I would pay a lot for a magic school bus.
But then it wouldn't be history. Then it'd just be like journalism because you're actually seeing it. You're right there with it.
Yeah, and I'm not entirely positive that if I were there in the woods of Western New York on that spring morning that I would see what he saw. I might be standing right next to him and not invited to the vision. I don't know.
As were many of the visions that Joseph Smith had.
Certainly in February 1832, he and Rigdon were privy to a series of visions that people standing in the room with them did not see. Right.
There's an incredible book, and this is a little bit of a tangent, by Carl Ricks Anderson, Savior in Kirtland.
Yeah.
And he talks about how there's secondary visions where the person isn't experiencing the vision, but they're seeing people having the vision. And for one of the accounts, the woman's like, I know that they were having a vision because they were bright. They were illuminated, even though I couldn't see the vision they were having, which is just incredible to me.
It's pretty cool.
Sorry, that was a tangent. But the last thing I'd like to talk about today, and to me, I think that this is one of the bigger concerns that I know many people have, is late appearances of the first vision. So before we dive into why that might be, I want to first ask, Joseph Smith has his first vision. Boom. Well, who does he tell immediately after? And I do this test with my friends, my roommates often, and they're immediately like, well, he went and told his dad. They're thinking about the story of Moroni coming. Yeah. They say he goes and tells his mom, because he goes and tells his mom. She says, what's the matter? He says, well, I just know Presbyterianism isn't true. We don't know if he tells her the whole first vision. Likely he didn't, unless you want to correct me if I'm wrong.
I think it's likely that he didn't.
But long story short, he didn't tell these people. So who all did he tell, and why didn't he tell more people?
Terrific question. So I'm going to answer it with precision. I'm going to do what we invite everyone to do. Think slow.
Right.
So you know how you know what you know. What you're asking me, what do I know about who Joseph told and how do I know it? Well, what I know, I hear this all the time, but everybody out there, listen super carefully. I don't know who he tells and when he tells. What I know is what the historical records say about that. And what they say about that is that the earliest account of the vision, 1832 history, says, I could find no one who would believe the heavenly vision. He does not say who he tried to find, who he told, just I could find no one. We have nothing else in the historical record from Joseph about who he told until we get to the manuscript history, when he says, some few days after this vision, I happened to be in company with a Methodist minister who was influential in the aforementioned religious excitement. I took the occasion to tell him of the vision, and he responded with great contempt, saying it's all of the devil. That is all the historical record says about who Joseph tells and when. Now, a careful thinking person will limit themselves to that. They will not pretend to know anything other than that about who he tells. A not carefully thinking person will say, well, of course he tells his mom and dad. Mm-hmm. Of course he tells everybody else. To which
they do some presentism. If this happened to me, I'd go and tell my family. Yeah. So why wouldn't Joseph Smith tell his family?
Exactly. And I call that, as you know, hypothetical history. Mm-hmm. If this happened to me, this is how it would have gone down. To which I say, how do you know?
Right. Didn't happen to you.
Yeah, you don't know what you would do if you were Joseph and in that environment and in those circumstances. You don't even know what you would do or I would do, right? It's nothing more than my imagination about what would happen if. That's a terrible, terrible, terrible way to find out what actually happened in the past. It sets you up for being devastated because your knowledge is your imagination. And then you compare, finally you get around to the historical records and you find they don't confirm your imagination, and you think the history never happened the way you knew it happened. All you did is thought too fast and too lazily, and were devastated that what you assumed is not a sound assumption. Well, people who think slower and more carefully don't have that problem. And people who are taught the historical record the way I was taught it by Professor Bachman, and taught interpretation of the historical record the way I've been taught it by Professor Allen or Professor Bushman, they don't have that trouble. It's another way to say this is, it's not people who know too much about the first vision who disbelieve it. It's people who think they know more than they do about the first vision. Yeah.
And I think the most important thing that I would say, at least that I'm getting out of today, is go and study the primary accounts
for yourself
and then triangulate it with the Spirit.
Right.
Allow God to tell you what is the truth. Allow Joseph Smith himself to tell you what is the truth. And then let's test. Let's go into it. Let's read why are there these differences? How can I work through these? But I'm here to testify that the first vision happened. I think you, who have studied it more than just about anybody we could get, would testify that it happened.
I testify that it happened.
But it only comes by your personal study. It doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter what I say.
That's right.
It matters what God says to you as you study it.
Yeah. It's a fallacious or an error for me to try to tell people you should believe it because I'm an authority and I believe it. That's not what I'm saying to anyone.
Right.
I'm saying I've done a lot of work on this, and I believe it. And I'm offering that as an invitation to anyone else to do that work themselves. And I don't know that they'll arrive at the same conclusion I have, but I know that they can't tell me that I don't know what I know. I'm inviting them to have the same wonderful experience that I've had. I hope they do. And, that's all I'm asking for.
And if they do not, it doesn't discount what you have experienced.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I mean, think of it. Somebody's going to get on my case for bearing my witness. Well, the critics are bearing their witness. I know beyond a shadow of a doubt the first vision didn't happen. And you know my question, right? How do you know? Mm-hmm. How do you know? They've got to make a case that is similar to mine. Well, I've studied the historical records. Well, I doubt you've studied them more than I have. Right. Well, I know there's no spiritual witness. I know there's no revelation. How do you know? How do you know? How can you prove a negative that there's no spiritual witness? There's no revelation.
Right.
So I feel confident in my own epistemology, my own way of knowing, which combines hard-headed historical methodology trained by the very finest scholars, whom the Academy has recognized as the finest scholars. They didn't get an award from the church. They've been awarded and recognized by their peers. Right. And I've learned from them not only how to think carefully about historical records, but I've also learned from them and from Joseph himself, above all, how to ask in faith and seek and receive.
Right.
It works.
It works. Steve, do you have anything to add before we conclude?
I just want people to when they're thinking about these things, be careful not just to think about the outward facts. Do some work to say, what do I know and how do I know it? Why do I? If I'm bent on proving the vision didn't happen, why? What in the world is going on in your life? What has happened to make that your priority, your driving force, right? I've done that myself. What motivates me? What is it that I'm after? I'm after the truth, and I'm after love. Those are the two things I want more than anything else, is truth and love. And I don't want to believe the vision if it isn't true. Okay?
Right.
I don't even want to believe in a God if there is one that isn't love, that isn't loving. And I find in the first vision of Joseph Smith a true account of a God of love who condescends to answer anxious teenagers when they're worried about their sinful state. That's beautiful. That's what I want. And if those things were somewhere else, I would go where those things are. But I have found truth and love in Joseph Smith's first vision. And I would like everyone else to have that experience of truth and love that I've had. That's why I want to share it.
I love that. And Steve, I just want to bear witness of what you said. And I testify that you can find the God of love as you do the things that we've been promised will bring that God of love into your life. Scripture study, prayer, looking into the history, thinking, seeking, learning by study and by faith. He is there.
He is indeed.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for today. We invite you to share this with your friends, your family, your loved ones, anybody that you think might benefit from this. Make sure to like, subscribe, and we will talk to you next time.